All right, good morning. So we're in the Gemara comparing and juxtaposing the Jews who successfully entered the land of Eretz Yisrael with Yeshua crossing the Jordan, and discussed the events of them taking the stones to build a monument, taking stones from the river to bring into the land. And we compared that to the spies who failed to enter into the land of Israel, tried to sabotage that entry. And they're carrying fruit from the land of Israel back to the desert in an effort to scare the people from this land that's so absurd, that has such large fruit. And we noted this distinction that, the verse itself actually implies that when it comes to the stone, each stone was carried by a singular individual. Whereas when it comes to the fruit, we see, obviously, with the grapes, they're all helping each other. We're trying to understand that. Rabbi Gimple emailed me and suggested that perhaps not so much that it's juxtaposing the negative of the spies versus the positive of the entry, but so much on the nature of spying versus conquest. Each person has to carry their own responsibility, and when it comes to spying, each person they have to work in concert together. I suppose that's a good practical sort of understanding. Meaning when you're working clandestinely, everybody has to communicate openly so they can work things out. So they're helping each other carry. But when you're conquering, each person has to carry the responsibility themselves. It's true. This even conquest requires cohesiveness, and working together. That's still an interesting thought. Okay, so the Gemara is going to briefly go back to discussing the crossing of the river under Joshua. We briefly discuss that, taking us back to the dispute we had at the beginning of this discussion, which was how high the water climbed as it piled up on this invisible dam created by the Kohanim holding the ark inside the river. So we had the dispute. One view was that it went 12. What was it, 12,000? No. 12 mil. 12 mil, which is how many amos? A few thousand. And that was one view because of the distance of the encampment, which is 12 mil. So enough for them to walk through. That was Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Lezer, son of Reb Shimon, said, it was 300 mil high. 12 mil or 300 mil. So the Gemara goes back to commenting on that. And then once it makes its final comment on that, it's going to go to discussing the spies. Right? Because really we're discussing the crossing into the land of Israel. Why did that come up? Because we're discussing the blessings and curses. And by the blessings and curses, the Kohanim carried the ark. So we're discussing the different occasions when the Kohanim carried the ark, including the crossing of the river under Joshua. Having raised the discussion on the crossing of the river under Joshua, the Gemara juxtaposed it to the spies carrying the fruit. So the Gemara is going to conclude the discussion on the crossing of the river under Joshua, and then enter into discussing the spies crossing, the spies entering, and then their scheme and plot.
Did it say how long it took them to cross the Jordan for all the people to cross?
It doesn't say explicitly, but we'll deduce that from the discussion right now, because the Gemara is going to discuss exactly that, based on how high the water piled up in these two views.
Right. Didn't we were learning that 12 mil wasn't high enough.
So view number one is 12 mil. View number two is it's not high enough, and therefore it takes more time.
300 is such a big discrepancy. It's hard to
Yes, we're going to discuss that right now. Yeah. So last line on Lamed Daled Amud Aleph, last line on 34a. The Gemara says, Pligiba, the following was disputed. You have it?
Yeah.
Pligiba, the following was disputed by Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha disputed as to the nature of the dispute between Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Huda is saying that the water piled up to 12 mil. Rabbi Eliezer is saying that the water piled up to 300 mil. What's at the root of their dispute? So that itself is disputed between Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. What undergirds their dispute? It's a massive discrepancy. So let's see. So Chad Amar, one of these two scholars, let's just put ourselves in the timeline, right? Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Huda are speaking in the Mishnah. So they are living in Eretz Yisrael sometime right after the destruction of the temple. Right, that's where they live. Rabbi Eliezer is the son of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So they're living in the Mishnaic, at the end of the Mishnaic era. Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Yitzchak and Nafcha live sometime towards the end of the Gemara's era. So we're talking about a few hundred years later. So we have this dispute in the Mishnah. How high did the water pile? 12 mil or 300 mil? And a few hundred years later, Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Yitzchak are arguing about the nature of that argument. Yeah?
So it's like a revisit of the original timings argument.
Yeah, it's often the case in the Gemara.
Yeah.
But just when you put it into like the timeline, it makes it easier
Yeah.
to visualize how this all went down. Okay, so Chad Amar, one of these two sages, either Rabbi Ami or Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, said the following. The Div Rabbi Yehuda, in Rabbi Yehuda's view, which said that the water piled up 12 mil, he is of the view that Kechana Yasan Avru. They walked across the river in exactly the same position and that they traveled throughout the desert, which we described earlier in this week's parsha. Earlier in this week's parsha, Parshas Nasai, we described the ark in the middle, the Levim around them, and then the space between them and the rest of the encampment, right? And it looked like a Swiss cross, right? You had three tribes: southwest, east, and north. South, west, north, and east. So in that exact position is how they walked. And that exact position is 12 mil. And that's why he says the water piled up 12 mil. This is view number one. The only difference being, as we already learned, that when they were traveling in the desert, the ark is in the middle. Whereas now when they're crossing the river, the ark in the front. But other than that, the position of everybody else is exactly as it was throughout the rest of the traveling in the desert, and therefore it's only 12 mil long, and therefore the water only piles up 12 mil. Okay.
What's 12 mil exactly?
The length of the encampment.
Length of the encampment.
Using this
12 by
design.
12 by 12 by 12.
That's right. So it's in lengthwise, it's only 12. And that's 12 mil will pile up water because of the 12 mil it takes to cross. That's it. That is the view of Rabbi Yehuda based on one of these two views, either of Ami or Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. Now, the Rabbi Eliezer ben Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Eliezer, son of Rabbi Shimon, is of the view in this interpretation. They crossed one after the other. Now,
Sorry, so that's also Rabbi Ami's view? It's also
sorry?
Rabbi Ami's view is the 12 mil view?
Rabbi Ami's view is 12 mil.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, actually, Rashi says here that Rabbi Eliezer, son of Rabbi Shimon, is of the view that it's more than 300 mil. Yeah, yes, higher than 300 mil. Yeah. So that's the view of Rabbi Yehuda, that they walked exactly as they encamped, 12 mil long, and therefore 12 mil of water piling up. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon says they walked single file, one by one. So Rashi explains this. So single file, one by one, how many people is that? Something like 2 million people to walk single file.
It never costs it one day. That's
Way too long. And that's why he says it's much higher than 300 mil. That's why he says it piled up that high. Right? Even though What did Rabbi Lezer say in the Mishnah? He said it could not be 12 mil high because water moves quicker than people. So even if you're going to go to your view, Rabbi Yehuda, that they walked in the shape of their encampment, so their walking was only 12 mil wide, 12 mil long, but the water would still pile up more than 12 mil. And if it only went 12 mil, the water would have poured over and drowned them, at least the back end of the people, because people move slower than water. Right? That's what Elazar argued. That's what Elazar argued to Rabbi Yehuda. So even your view that they walked in the shape of the encampment, 12 mil is still not enough. Now, in my view, that they went single file one by one, it's got to be way more than 300 or more than 300. And that's the great discrepancy. Because not only is Rabbi Lezer making the point that water moves faster than people, and therefore the distance of the people has to be less than the distance of the height of the water, right? Moreover, in my view, it was single file walking.
So
And thus the mass discrepancy between 1200 and over 300.
He's not just disputing it based on the arrangement of the encampment and how they walked out. He argues on two different reasons.
Okay, yes, that's right.
Which is important.
Yes, and that's what's being added here, because the Mishnah itself already told us that the Rabbi Lezer is arguing based on the fact that water is faster than people.
Yeah.
But this reading now, either of Ami or Rabbi Tzachnath is adding, there's another element of dispute, which is that they walk single file or in the shape of their encampment, which now accounts for the great discrepancy. Because if following.
Oh, yeah, so that's what they're bringing new to the.
That's correct. That's what this discussion is bringing to the table. That's right. Because the Mishnah text already made this point.
It's only on encampment orders.
That's right. The original text already made the point that Rabbi Lezer is arguing based on whether water is faster or people are faster. Right? That was already stated in the Mishnah text. When Rabbi Lezer made his argument against Rabbi Yehuda said 12 mil, and Rabbi Lezer argued. Rabbi Lezer says in the Mishnah text, water is faster, and if it's only 12 mil, people are going to drown if the water only piles 12 mil high because the water's going to fall over. But even at the slowest pace, it's still faster. It's lighter. It's literally lighter. It's faster, assuming it's moving. I mean, go to the Jordan. The Jordan moves.
Water doesn't get tired.
Right, but especially water doesn't have kids, doesn't have to carry backpacks, doesn't have to schlep donkeys, right? Whereas the humans do. Right, and go to the Jordan. It's not a rapid. I mean, some places are rapids, but it moves. The river moves, and certainly faster than humans. Right. So that part of the argument was already stated in the Mishnah text. What's being added now here is, in addition to that, Rabbi Lezer is also arguing that it's single file, which makes a discrepancy, which accounts for the discrepancy between 12 mil versus 300 mil. Because it's A, water is faster, and B, it's single file line, taking a much longer to get across. Okay.
We don't know how wide the water was, how wide the expanse was.
Sorry?
We don't know how wide the river was.
At that point, at that point. I'm sure it is known. I just don't know. No, it's possible. Okay, now furthermore, well, it does make a difference because the height of the water would be spread even against the whole width. So it doesn't matter how high, how in other words, the river rolls down and stops at the Kohanim, but it doesn't get wider. It just stays where it stays in that width and piles up. So whether it's thin or narrow, the height would stay the same.
But yeah,
It would just take more time to cross. Yes, but the math accounts for the width, considering that the water doesn't get wider.
the big play is how wide that river was.
Yeah.
It could take a week for 3 million people plus the animals and everything.
Yeah, that took a long time. Okay, so this is one reading of the dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Lezer, that there are two issues at play here. A, the issue that Rabbi Lezer makes the point that water is faster than humans, and therefore the 12 mil isn't enough for 12 mil high of water. And B, in Rabbi Lezer's view, they walk single file, making the water have to pile way higher in order for everybody to get across.
Actually, if there was big rocks in the water,
Mm-hmm.
it was probably rapids.
That is a good point too, yeah. If there's 12 big rocks.
The current was swift,
Mm-hmm.
so it piled up fast.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. So maybe that's also part of their argument, how fast the water was. But the Gemara doesn't say that specifically. Neither does Rashi, but. Okay, Chad Amar. Now the other of the two stages, either of Ami or Bitzak Nafcha, gives another understanding to the dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Lezer. Namely, Bein Mar Bein Mar, both Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Yehuda agree that they crossed in the same shape as they traveled, in that Swiss-shaped cross. Which means the dispute is only singular on the account of is our people as fast as water. Mar Savar, Rabbi Yehuda is of the view, Adam Kal, that man, if he runs, is fast enough to be the same speed as water. That's how Rashi interprets this. Which would mean, in this reading of Rabbi Yehuda, people have to run across the river in the shape of the Swiss cross. It's quite a feat.
Carrying the rocks.
Only 12 people carry the rocks, right?
Only 12 carrying.
So they could have been carrying the rocks whilst this is all happening.
That's heavy and what?
They didn't have to run.
They didn't have to.
No, in other words, if everybody's running here, and that takes, let's say 12 hours, how many hours it takes for people to run across 12, that whole thing, 1,200 mil worth of people. Sorry, 12 mil worth of people, how long does it take to cross? A few hours, even if they're running, right? So during those few hours, 12 guys go and pick up the rocks and move during those few hours. I'm not following. The 12 people don't, the 12 people don't have to be running along with everybody else. They're selected earlier. They go into the river to carry the rocks. The other people run across as they're slowly carrying the boulders. Not following?
Because
Okay.
why are they running in the first place?
Talk it out.
Because they
Why do those 12 people have to run?
keep pace with the water.
Why do they keep pace with water?
Because water generally is faster than people's walking.
But the water's not just waiting for them. The water's waiting for all millions of people. Play it out. The 12, okay, let's do it this way. There's 12 mil of people. They're running across the water. How long does that take? And during that time, the water's piling up 12 mil, right?
Yeah.
How long does that take from beginning to end? At least a couple of hours,
Yeah.
right? A marathon is only how many feet of people running? 500 people, right? You don't measure just the first guy from beginning to end. You got to measure from the first guy starts to the last guy ends. Right? How long does that take? Much longer than just the first guy running from beginning to end. The guy who ran first could be waiting for an hour and a half for the last guy to come across. Right? So it's 12 mil of people are. That's right. So 12 mil of people running across still takes a few hours. That's how much time those 12 guys have to go to get the rock. Following? They don't have to run with everybody else. Let everybody run, and they're going to slowly carry the rocks across while the running is happening and the water's piling up. Following?
They didn't know at what point it's going to collapse.
Well, they know it's going to collapse only after all the people cross.
Yeah.
So they can see 12 mil of people running.
Still scary.
Now, I understand. It's imagine,
Yeah.
right, but imagine standing at the beginning of a marathon and standing there and waiting for every single person in a marathon to cross the start line. Just cross the start line.
The first person in 2 hours.
No, but you all you have to do is wait how long does it take for you to stand at the start line of a marathon and wait for everybody to cross the start line?
7 hours.
To wait for everybody to start to cross the start line, never mind the finish line. Yeah. How long does that take? What?
All depends on the crowd.
Right, exactly my point. So you have 12 mil of crowd, even if they're all running, how long would you be waiting there for everybody to cross the start line? A good 2-3 hours. That's how much time they have to carry the rocks. Following?
Oh, it's the start line, not the finish.
Yes.
That's how I got it.
Plus the finish line. But even if they're waiting for the guy in the back, in other words, if they're standing at the beginning to carry the rocks, they can see for 12 mil of people. They have to wait for all of them. They have all the time it takes for all of them to run across. They don't need to run with them. Following? Just practical.
I ran the New York Marathon. There's 20,000 people there.
That's right. And we're talking about here 2 million. So 20,000 take up how long? A kilometer long of people? We're talking about 12 mil. It's a huge amount of people. It's a long time to be able to have time. Even if they're all running, you have plenty of time to carry the rocks, certainly.
And I was near the front, and it took me 20 minutes to reach the starting line.
See, there you go. There you go. So times that by 12 mil. Times that by 12 mil of people waiting behind you. And you're at the beginning. Still took you 20 minutes to get to the start line, never mind the finish line.
Yeah, you have to sort of visualize.
That's what I'm saying.
the
Exactly.
Magnitude of people.
Exactly.
It's not like just
Exactly.
10 people.
Exactly. That's right. So all to say that this second understanding of Rabbi Huda is that they ran across, and therefore they're the same speed of water, and therefore the water only had to pile up 12 mil. Whereas Mar Savar, Rabbi Lezer is of the view, Mayim Kalam, waters are still quicker. As fast as they ran, the water is still quicker, and therefore even if they're going fast, it's still going to pile up 300 mil. So maybe the root of the argument is the point you're making. How fast were the rapids? If the water is moving slowly and the people are running across, maybe they could be the same speed. And therefore 12 mil of people equals 12 mil of water. Which Rabbi Lezer says, I don't know, it was rapids there. So 12 mil of people, even if they're going rather quickly, it doesn't say they're going quickly. Let's say they're going at a regular pace. The height of the water piled up is over 300 mil. And that would be the explaining the discrepancy. So two ways to explain the large discrepancy between Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Lezer. One is they're arguing A, about the speed of water. B, they're arguing about single file versus in the shape of encampment. Explanation A. Explanation B is everybody agrees they went in the shape of the encampment. Rabbi Huda's view is when running, they're the same speed as water. Rabbi Lezer's view is even if they're running, water is way faster. There's the two versions of understanding the dispute. Yeah, what do you want to say?
I'm just wondering why there was a discussion about the height of the water in the first place.
Well, on a basic level, they're doing it because they want to know God's Torah. So they're analyzing it. I'm sure there are deeper levels to what this means. Why 12 mil? Why over 300?
Well, maybe, I guess.
It also,
12 is the size of the encampment.
right, that's clear. But it's funny that Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Lezer says over 300. Rabbi Yehuda gives a definitive number, exactly 12 mil. Whereas Rabbi Lezer doesn't give an exact number. It says over 300. What is that? 301, 310, 400, 500? What's over 300? Doesn't give any number. That itself is something that makes me curious.
It's a bit seemingly arbitrary.
Yeah. But he does say that its height was so effective that people from far and wide were able to see it. And this instilled this fear of the new conquerors. Right? The people, as the Gemara commented, still remembered and trembled from the splitting of the sea 40 years earlier. So how the more so when they see a 300 wall of water, 300 mil high wall of water, they're freaking out. Right? So that was Rabbi Lezer's point, which, okay, that's what the Gemara says. Now, just to ask the question, and 12 mil doesn't instill fear in people? 12 mil of water. Rabbi Lezer says, in my view, that they went to 300 and something mil, people from far and wide could see, and they're all freaking out. Oh my gosh, these people are incredible miracles. They're conquering our land. They instilled the fear of the Jewish people in them. 12 mil doesn't do that. 12 mil of water is higher than the mountain that we can all see in Montreal. 12 mil?
What's a mil again?
Roughly a kilometer.
Oh, wow. A kilometer high?
12 of those. They're quite huge. Let's look it up. Talmudic measures mil. It's high. Okay. A mil is about either 963, either meters, yes, either 3160 or 3760 feet. So let's say it's about 3,500 feet high. 12 times that. That's not high enough to instill fear around the neighbors. So it's interesting that, like, Rabbi Elezer's view, that's when he says, oh, because it's over 300 mil, that's why it instilled fear. 12 mil doesn't instill fear. That would freak me out, would it not? So that is also something that's making me curious about what's really going on here in this dispute. But again, the floor is open, as has been the last few days, to figure out what's the deeper meaning behind all this discussion. Looking at the Gemara again. Yeah. The Gemara seems, the Mishnah text seems to be implying that the 300 mil instilled the fear. The Gemara says it here. Oiling keeping, the waters went heap after heap. Yes, mil, higher than 300 mil. To the point that all the kings of the east and the west, they all saw it. So the 300 mil piled heap after heap, making everybody in the neighborhood freak out. And the 12 mil didn't pile heap after heap, making everybody freak out. Like, why is the description like that reserved for Belezer and not for Behuda? It's another thing that's just making me curious about what's really going on in here.
As high as the Alps.
It's huge. How high is Mount Everest? Just to get just
24,000 feet.
that's still not that's about as high as this.
Yeah, I'm telling you, it's as high as the Alps.
It's huge. 12 mil. And that's enough to make everybody. No, yeah. Well, 3,500 times 12 is how much?
36,000
How many thousand feet? How many thousands of feet is it?
feet.
And how high is Mount Everest?
As high as America.
36,000 feet. How high?
About 24 to 26,000 feet.
So it's as tall as the Alps, and that's not going to make everybody freak out. So that's what I'm wondering, like, why the Gemara seems to be putting that language of heap after heap to the point that everybody saw it by Rabbi Lezer's description of 300 mil, and that's not there for the 12 mil of Rabbi Yehuda, which seems to be just as impressive and just as scary. So I'm wondering, there must be something deeper, obviously, going on here. And like you said, why are they even arguing at all that high the water went? Like, who cares? Obviously, there's something deeper going on here, and the floor is open.
I guess it was a swift current. It had to be a swift current.
Well, that would also be maybe like you're suggesting. Maybe that's the discrepancy between whether people are as fast as water, depending on how fast the rapids are at that location. Maybe that's part of the discussion. Although the Gemara doesn't state though explicitly, but you can read that into the Gemara very safely. Anyway, obviously there's some deeper spiritual struggle here about the number 12 and the number 300, and why 300 is related to the fear of people around, and the 1200 somehow doesn't talk to that, but rather talks to. Well, let's put it this way. Interesting distinction now that I'm talking it out. Like you said, what's the 12? The 12 mil corresponds to the 12 tribes that are crossing, right? Or / 12 mil of people that are crossing. Yeah. Of encampment, yeah. The 300 is fear of the nations. So maybe what's at the core of this.
A 1-to-1 correlation, 1 mil per 1 mil in distance equals 1 mil in height.
That's right. That's a Behuda's view.
That was the computation.
That's a Behuda's computation. 12 mil of people to 12 mil of water.
It's like
because of the same speed.
move at the same rate.
That's exactly right. They're the same speed. Whereas Rabbi Elezer's view is no, water is way faster.
25 times.
Exactly. And therefore, so maybe what's at the root of the dispute here is when the water split, who is it for? Was it for when the river stopped? Who was it for? Was it for the Jews? And if it's for the Jews, then the number of height is going to match the number of the Jews. And therefore, the fact that it scares everybody around the world is not the point. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. That's not the point. Because Hashem didn't do it for the nations. Hashem did it for the Jewish people. And if the number is going to match the number of encampment of the Jewish people. And maybe therefore, the water is the same speed as the people. Because the point of the water is for the people. The point of this miracle. Or Rabbi Lezer's view is, no, the point of the miracle wasn't for the people. The point of the miracle was Hashem wanted to impose a fear on the nations. And therefore, it's going to be heap on heap. And therefore, the main issue here is the fact that it causes fear. Not that it didn't cause fear when there was 12 mil. It did. That's not the point. Maybe that's at the root of the dispute. Who was the miracle for? For the people, and therefore the number of the height is going to match the people. And therefore, whether it did freak everybody else out, it's not relevant. The point is it's for the people. Or is the miracle not so much for the Jewish people? The Jewish people didn't need the miracle. The miracle was to demonstrate to the world what's going on here. And therefore, the Gemara's description is heap after heap after heap to the point that everybody freaked out. And somehow the number 300 is related to that. Maybe that's what's going on here.
Maybe it's a blending.
Yeah.
Miracle and natural order. Meaning it's still a miracle because order doesn't normally stand.
Right, but the nature of which
the rate at which it moves is.
That's
one
right.
is purely miracle, and the other one is a hybrid of miracle.
They're both miracle, actually. But they're both hybrid.
The 300 one is a combination of miracle.
So is it 12? I think the point you're making, tell me if I'm wrong, is that God could have just made the river stop. Could have made the river just stop. But he didn't. He made the river continue, but stop at a certain point. Thus creating this hybrid where the miracle is that it stops here, but the natural thing is that if it stops here, it keeps piling up. Is that what you're saying? But that's true whether it's 300 or 12. Right? Which is a good point. Something to think about. Something to think about why the river didn't stop, but rather it continues. The river itself continues to flow, but stops at this miraculous point, as opposed to just miraculously the whole river stops. Right, that itself is something to think about, yeah.
Really, when you go through a sacred chasm,
God willing, yeah.
when you do it, you'll see how fast water goes.
Oh, I've seen
And then
rapids,
you'll
yes.
believe how it can build up.
No, I know that. I'm not worried about that. I can see that I've seen rapids. That's anyways, there's lots to think about. And let's go even further. Remember the Rebbe's talk Shabbos afternoon. We were learning about Eliyahu Hanavi and why Eliyahu Hanavi arrives before Mashiach comes. And the Rebbe made the point there that we cannot argue about fact on the ground. Here they're arguing about fact on the ground. Was it 12 mil or 300 mil? Are they not? Yeah. So how do we explain that?
You can argue, but only one can be correct. Is that?
Chas v'shalom, it's Torah. They have to both be correct, right? So therefore, they have to somehow both be correct. In their spiritual nature, they have to be correct, at least for sure, certainly, right? Which means at their core, they're really arguing about the spiritual nature of what's happening here. And therefore, I'm suggesting maybe that there was at the root of the art. I don't have this fully fleshed out, but since we're having this discussion, I think this is what's coming to me. Like Rabbi Yehuda is of the view that it's 12 mil. He's of the view that the nature of the revelation here is for the Jewish people. What's the objective of the miracle? Who is it for?
They made two statements.
One second. There's two. Who is the miracle for? In Rabbi Yehuda's view, the miracle is for the Jewish people. It so happens that people that the nations of the world freaked out because they saw 12 mil high. Maybe yes, maybe no, not relevant. Because the miracle is for the Jewish people. And therefore, in the Gemara's description of Rabbi Yehuda's view, it's not going to mention the fact that it freaks everybody else out. It's not the point of the miracle. The point of the miracle is for the Jewish people. And therefore, the miracle is going to match the experience of the Jewish people. 12 mil high. 12 mil of people, 12 mil high. 12 tribes, 12 mil high. Right? Because the point of the miracle is for the Jewish people, even if it happens to freak everybody else out. Whereas the Levites of the view, the primary objective of the miracle wasn't for the people. They didn't need that miracle. The primary objective of the miracle is for the nations of the world. And therefore here, when the Gemara describes it, Belezer's view, it says heap after heap to the point that it freaked everybody out from all directions. Not because it didn't freak anybody out according to Yehuda's view. It did, but it wasn't the point of the miracle. And therefore, Yehuda's not going to describe that. Because the point of the miracle is the people. I'm just making a...
This miracle is for both the Jewish people and the nations.
And the question is, which one you're highlighting? Yehuda is highlighting it's for the Jewish people, and therefore he describes it as 12 mil high to match 12 mil of people. Whereas Eliezer is highlighting the fact that it freaked the world out, and therefore he describes it as heap after heap after heap to the point that all nations everywhere were freaking out. Maybe that's what's happening here.
I think
The root of maybe.
I think the main point was that that Hashem wants to make a statement.
But to who? That's Elezer's view.
Wow, if they could do if God could do that for these people.
That's Elezer's view. That's exactly Elezer's view. Whereas Yehuda makes no mention of the people and the nations freaking out. Even though seemingly 12 mil high would freak everybody out. Well, so why doesn't he mention that? Because in Rabbi Yehuda's view, that's not the point of the miracle. Even though it did that, but the main objective of the miracle is to inspire the people. And therefore he's going to describe the water as matching the people.
He could have just stopped the water.
That's right. Exactly.
There are going two sides of the same coin.
Perhaps. That's my perhaps.
This also goes back to we were discussing how far east, how far west. About the sun setting, the shadow. About the shadow.
We didn't discuss that here. I don't think we discussed that here. Might be something else you're learning.
Discussing the north and the east.
Yeah, the east, how
East
far?
and the west.
Yeah, how far west?
Oh, yes.
What was that?
Oh, when they were
Where the geographic location
of the two mountains.
of the two mountains.
When it
Correct,
says
correct.
when it says behind the coming of the sun,
Yes.
does that mean
That's what I'm
that's right? Yes.
That's also a disputed fact, right?
Yeah. So also there you might have to argue
So
is
you have to sort of think about why.
there too. Actually, according to the view which says they went very far out, the point was to be deep into near Shechem, where the nations are. Whereas the other view was that it's right after they came out of Jordan. Maybe that's primarily for the people. That's also that we could tie that in, perhaps. Very good.
That'd be an example as well as where there's a factual dispute.
Right, but I don't know if you remember on Shabbos I spoke about this. I quoted the Midrash Shmuel. Midrash Shmuel is a commentary on Pirkei Avos. And he writes in the Mishnah in chapter 5, which reads, the Mishnah says, any dispute that is for the sake of heaven, that dispute is going to be sustained. What's an example of a dispute that's for the sake of heaven? Hillel and Shammai. That's what the Mishnah says there. So the Medrash Shmuel asks, well, why would I want the dispute to be sustained? I don't want the dispute to be settled. What's the virtue in a dispute being sustained? Right? Seems strange. He explains the Medrash Shmuel because he gives a whole bunch of explanations. But he says, when you're arguing in Torah, both opinions are correct. So when it's for the sake of heaven, then all opinions can be correct. And therefore, yes, the dispute sustains all the way to the end. Because always, even if you follow one view, the other view is still correct. That's for the sake of heaven. But if it's not for the sake of heaven, one must consume the other. So when it's for the sake of heaven, arguments can be peaceful and be sustained because everybody has a correct view in their relationship with God. But if it's not for the sake of heaven, then one must consume the other. This is what the Medrash Shmuel explains. So when he's going along that route, he explains how disputes in Torah remain sustained. So when it comes to halachic disputes, it's easy to understand how halachic disputes are sustained. Because as long as both views are using the principles of interpretation as per the written oral tradition, and even if you only follow one of them practically, but the other guy's still right because he used the interpretation of the correct interpretation of Torah, right? It's easy. But how do you sustain a dispute? In fact, ask the Medrash Shmuel. When you find in the Medrash a dispute as to what Abraham did, or here we're learning how high was the water. How do you sustain that dispute? Seemingly one is correct. That's what the Medrash Shmuel asks. So explains the Medrash Shmuel, and the author besides this in Likutei Torah, explains like this. Really, the dispute here is not about the physical nature of what happened. They're really arguing about the spiritual nature of what's happening. And in the world of spirituality, both of these things are true. So what's happening in this dispute? Rabbi Huda is not arguing whether it was 12 mil or 300 mil. He's arguing about the spiritual nature of the event. Now, if his spiritual nature is correct, then this is how it must have played out in physical. Because the physical reality mirrors the spiritual reality, right? And therefore, he's arguing about the nature spiritually of what happened. And if this is the spiritual nature, then this is how it must have played out physically, right? Whereas Rabbi Shimon says, the spiritual nature of the event is X, and therefore must have played out physically here. They will both agree that only one of the two happened physically. But in their spiritual truth, which is where they're really arguing, they're both true. Because spiritually speaking, they're both true. The question is, which one of these spiritual truths played out physically? And in that realm, only one could happen. But their dispute is still sustained because in the spiritual truth, which is what they're really arguing about, they're both right. That's what the Midrash Shmuel explains. Following? Which would mean, if this is the case then when the Rebbe says that you can't actually argue in dispute, you can't argue about fact, it's only when you're arguing about physical fact, not when you're arguing about spiritual fact. So when there's a dispute about what Eliyahu is going to do, that's a physical fact. Which one is Eliyahu going to do? And therefore there has a problem. But if the argument to begin with is a spiritual nature, and they're only arguing in, which spiritual truth manifests physically, but their argument is originally in the spiritual truth, there's no problem to have multiple views sustained. Because there's multiple views of spirituality. In the spiritual realm, all these things are true. The question is only which one played out physically. And physically, only one of them played out. Because you can't have two different versions of physical fact.
So,
but that's a limitation on the physical part, that we can't sustain more than two versions of reality. But in the spiritual realm, you can have simultaneously or even incorporated, like you said, two sides of one coin. You can have two spiritual truths coexisting simultaneously in a spiritual world. Because why not? It's only in the physical world we have the issue of one versus the other. And therefore, at the root of these disputes is not the physical reality, but the spiritual truth. But they're arguing if this is the dominant spiritual truth, then this is how it must have played out physically. But not they're arguing about the physical reality. That's what the Medrash Shmuel explains. Yeah?
Will this be the spiritual world when Mashiach comes?
So this will be the physical world, but in the physical world, we'll be able to perceive the truths of the spirituality behind the physical world. So it's possible you look at this table and see multiple spiritual energies related to this table. And you might see the dominant force behind this table as X, and I'll see Y as the dominant force behind this table. Even if though We're both looking at the same physical table,
Right.
right?
So the machlokes won't be resolved.
That's the point.
Right.
The Mishnah says they're both sustained, not resolved.
Right.
That's the point. This is why the Mishnah will go through this whole exercise. Because the Mishnah says that the dispute, for the sake of heaven, it won't be resolved. It'll be sustained. Why would I want to sustain it?
Right.
Because they're both spiritually true. So why would I not want to sustain them? Following?
Yeah.
It's only in physicality that we're limited. We have to stick with one. Okay, so we'll stick with one. So because I'm only doing halacha this way, therefore the other guy's opinion is wrong.
Right.
That's the beauty of the sustained dispute.
Well, that's why the Gemara, many of the arguments remain unresolved.
That's right. And this is it's a beautiful thing.
True, it's just
That's
because,
right.
as you say, they follow the laws of derivation.
Rabbi, that's the beauty of the paradoxes. When we see that spiritual dimension deep within ourselves through our souls, like yeshiva lamala or yeshiva lamata, like bati legani. These are the elements that we suddenly realize there's so many dimensions
That's
that
right.
we can soar above in transcendence when we're able to touch those, like bati legani, Yerushalayim lamala velamata, understand the yeshiva lamala be yeshiva lamata.
Yeah.
They're just so many elements that are so magnificent that we can be able to transcend in so many different places. As a matter of fact, I just sent something to your father, which I wrote. I thought about it all of Shavuot, and I thought of Bati Legani, how it must been seen from God's point of view. And I wrote the whole poem from God's point of view, how I want to be with my beloved. From his point of view, why did I have to leave to the seventh heaven?
That was in the
God,
Mosaic, right?
seventh heaven, and waited for 7 generations from Abraham
That
to
was
Moses
yeah.
to finally to make it. And the same thing with the 7 Rebbes. So it's
The Mosaic. Yeah.
so what you're teaching today, Rabbi, is absolutely beautiful, because
Thank you.
even Everest can be transcended within ourselves when we can go beyond it.
Yeah.
Should be blessed, Rabbi.
Yeah. It's a very valuable lesson, even in our own personal lives, is if two people are disputing something, it's not in Torah, but they're disputing something. If the two of them believe that the other person has proper motive for the sake of heaven, in other words, we both want the right thing. We just have different views of how to get there. If that's how we can look at our dispute, then we can sustain our dispute. But if each of us look at the other one and say, oh no, you're motivated by selfishness, and therefore I must be motivated by selfishness, then the only way for this dispute to settle is if one consumes the other.
Is that what happened with Rabbi Akiva's students?
Precisely. The lack of respect is the lack of ability to see that the other person has a good point of view. It's exactly right. It's exactly right. It's a lesson in marriage and relationships. If you assume that the other party has malicious intent, then the argument must end in one party consuming the other. Because you have malicious intent, and the other person thinks I have malicious intent. How can I let it be? But if we begin with the premise and we acknowledge we both want the right thing, we both want the right thing, both doing it for the right purpose. That's the Shem, it's the sake of heaven. It's not a Torah dispute, it's even an interpersonal dispute, but we both agree that we want the right thing. And I can say, look, I have my view of how the right thing is, you have your view as the right thing is, and we'll find some compromise or whatever it is. However the resolution plays out, technically speaking, the mutual respect remains, and we don't have to devour each other, and therefore the dispute can be sustained. Sorry? Hillel and Shammai. In fact, the actual Hillel and Shammai, in fact, not the schools. In fact, the schools of Hillel and Shammai, the Gemara tells us, we discussed this on Shavuos at home. Weren't you there? We discussed the Hillel and Shammai, how the Gemara came to the conclusion to follow Hillel. You there?
I'm here later.
We're discussing this. And the Gemara says like this, that the schools of Hillel and Shammai argued for years. And in some sources, it seems as if the dispute got to the streets even, where some people are following the school. I think this is long after Hillel and Shammai themselves passed away, but the schools are going and there's arguments and all kinds of things. And the Gemara at one point comes to the conclusion, the sages come to the conclusion, say we have to put a stop, we have to take a side. This can't go on. So what did the sages conclude? To go with Hillel. Why? Says the Gemara, 2 reasons. Number one, Shoyu Aluvin, they were more pleasant people. The house of Hillel were more pleasant people. Sha'aluvin Hoyu, they were more pleasant, they were more forgiving, which is interesting. You're making a decision on halacha based on the guy's niceties. Why not based on the guy's truth and argument? Everybody's got truth in their argument, but we're going with the nicer guys. Number one. Reason number two, which is related, is as follows. Gemara said that Hillel, the house of Hillel, would first study the view of Shammai and only then give their own opinion. And because they first studied the house of Shammai before they give their own opinion, that's why we're going to follow Hillel. Again, this understanding that my opponent is not here for malicious intent. He also has a valid point of view. And therefore I have to understand it. And only afterwards I can give my point of view. And because of that, because Hillel sustained the view of Shammai, that's what Allah follows Hillel, says the Gemara.
Yeah, that's an example of the sake of heaven.
That's right. Exactly.
They don't want to just be right. They want to know what the.
That's right. That's right.
That's magnificent, because also in the Talmud, what we know in Sanhedrin, in Sanhedrin, the youngest person and the youngest judge would speak first, so that he would be able to speak, and the most senior judge, or the greatest seniority, would speak last.
Yep. Yep.
And the beauty of it is that here Hillel wanted to make sure that Shammai's view would be heard, whereas in Shammai's school, Hillel's view was not heard.
That's right. That's right. So ironically, it's because of Hillel and their understanding to argue for the sake of heaven that Shammai's view is sustained. Because they saw on the other a valid point of view. But if it's a selfish motivated dispute, it has to resolve in one devouring the other. There's no other option. Even in the scientific sense.
Maybe all the students of
God,
Akiva would have been saved. Maybe all the students of Akiva would have been saved if that would have happened.
That's right, precisely right. That's right. Robert made the point earlier. Yeah, he was echoing what you were saying, that the students of Akiva would have been saved if they understood this. Okay, you have a wonderful day and a good Ner Shabbos.
Good Shabbos, Rabbi, and good Shabbos to all of you. Thank you so much for the beautiful class.
For joining us. Wonderful to hear with you.
God bless you all. Thank you.
Yeah,